Hello, everyone. It's 6 p.m. here in East Africa. I'm calling in from a country called Uganda. I don't know if it's familiar to some of us, but Uganda is a country in East Africa. And you're all welcome to what is going to be a very insightful panel. My name is Mrs. Irene Mutuzo Sevume. And together with Greg, who happens to be the chair, I am humbled to serve alongside him as the vice chair of the Learning Technology Standards Committee of what we call the IEEE. Now, I do know some of us may be wondering what the IEEE is. So allow me just take on a few minutes to explain to you what it is. So the IEEE in full, called the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Standards Association, is one of the world's largest association of technical professionals. Currently, we have over 4,230 members, actually 423,000 members in over 160 countries. And what is the work that we do? We are tasked to ensure that there is advancement, that is in education and technical advancement of electrical and electronic engineering, telecommunications, computer engineering, and similar disciplines. And particularly the committee that we represent, which is called the Learning Technology Standards Committee of the IEEE, is tasked with pushing advancement in education. And recently, with a group of very brilliant people across the world, that I must say, we managed to draft a couple of recommended practices for learning and employment record ecosystems. And today, as we try to answer the question, what is the real value of SSI in learning and employment, we'll also be talking a bit about these practices and whether they are relevant to the European continent, whether they are relevant to the African continent, and whether they are relevant to all of us worldwide. And the way this webinar is going to run is we will be having 3 panel discussions that will be dissecting the main topic. And the first panel will be focusing on what is happening in Europe. So these panelists will be looking at what is the role of SSI in learning and employment in Europe. What does it look like currently, and what will it look like in the future? Then our second panel will now be focusing on Africa. What is happening in Africa when it comes to SSI in learning and employment? And I'm particularly very excited about this panel being from Africa. Then lastly, we all know that in order to push forward emerging trends of technology, we all need to come together as people from different continents and countries. And the last panel will be focusing on how can we together push these technologies? How can we together enable more flexible and more efficient data exchanges across different continents and the world? And I hope that you're as excited as I am to listen to our very knowledgeable panelists that have had a wide and extensive research and had extensive experience in taking part and implementing these technologies that we'll be talking about. Before we get into the first panel, I would like to invite our chair, Greg, to just brief us a bit about the standards that the LER committee has drafted and what we should expect. Over to you, Greg.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Irene, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you. I'm going to turn it over in just one sec to Kimberly to introduce the panel and to lead the first phase of this discussion. But just to create a common understanding, as Irene said, IEEE Learning and Employment Record Ecosystem Standard Recommended Practices are the framework that we're here to talk about and its implications to Africa, Europe, and globally. The idea is that by uncoupling education so that learning can be measured in smaller chunks, that we can enable a very different type of talent, global talent marketplace. So there are 5 recommendations made in the standard that are somewhat technical and have links to even more technical specifications. But we wanted to keep today's discussion at a bit of a higher level. So just from a process standpoint, the goal is to try to deliver a draft standard to the working group on February 2nd for a vote of the working group on March 2nd. It'll take more time after that to work its way through the rest of the IEEE process, but we expect to have a global published technical standard in 2023. So let me turn it over to Kimberly to introduce herself and the first panelists.
Over to you, Kimberly.
Great, thanks, Greg. Hi, I'm Kimberly Wilson-Linson, and I am the Director of Credential Ecosystems at Randa Solutions. And this has been really fun to prepare for, as I have gotten to read a lot about each of these panelists, and I'm so excited to meet them. One of the things that I think you will find very quickly is that they have a common thread between all of them, and that is that they have both practice in this, that they actually are doing this work in the field, and I'm hoping that they will share that work with us. And also, they are all extraordinarily passionate about this work, and I think that I was able to actually kind of pull a quote from each of them about what they believe, which was really fun. So let me first introduce Dominic Barron, who is co-founder and CEO at Walt ID. And I think Irene or Greg, I'm not sure if you can sort of spotlight folks as I introduce them, but Walt ID is a leading company in the field of decentralized identity. He's a serial entrepreneur. He has a degree from the University of Pennsylvania, from Oxford, and a law degree from the University of Vienna. And he's been a policy advisor and consultant to the UN and EU Commission. He says in his profile that it is our mission to enable developers to build identity, ownership, and trust into the web. Ultimately, this will transform digital interactions into an effortless and worry-free experience. And that resonated with me because I know I'm constantly sort of worried, like, am I giving away too much information? Am I not? Is this the right thing? And so I'm looking forward to hearing from Dominic. Irene Hernandez is the founder and CEO at Gattaca. She has an MBA from MIT Sloan School of Management and graduate degrees in telecommunications and aerospace. She's conducted extensive research in blockchain and decentralized grids, and directed the Solar Microgrid Financing Project for MIT Media Lab, which architected a privately owned, fully decentralized, self-regulating solar microgrid model that unlocks financing opportunities via blockchain. And in 2019, she founded Gattaca, a cybersecurity company offering decentralized digital identity technology. And she believes, here's my favorite quote from her, she believes in universal digital identities as the foundational layer of more inclusive, more efficient internet and a cornerstone to unlock a myriad of new business models. I know from my work that we are constantly thinking about how the business models are actually going to play out as this technology emerges and matures. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Irene. And David, the only person on the panel that I already knew, has over 20 years of experience in identity management and authorization systems. As a professor of information systems at the University of Kent, he left in 2020 to become a full-time CEO of Verifiable Credentials Ltd. He's an invited expert to W3C, Verifiable Claims Working Group, and a co-author of the W3 recommendation for verifiable credentials, Data Model 1.0. He is a UK BSI expert to the ISO ITU-TX.500 meetings and ISO mobile driving licenses. He's a contributor to DIF, Presentation Exchange, and OpenID Connect. He founded Verifiable Credentials in 2019 to evangelize and commercialize verifiable credentials. And if you've met David before, you know that he is an evangelist. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And lastly, Luca Boldrin is R&D at InfoCert and manages their research initiatives. InfoCert is the largest European trust service provider. After a career across different public and private organizations, he is also a professor at the Faculty of Computer Engineering at the University of Padova. And his core competencies are around trust services, identity management, distributed ledger, and information security. His passion is around investigating and producing and managing the real work around trust services, identity management, distributed ledgers, and security. So I think the first thing you probably are all taking away is what an incredibly proficient group of panelists this is. And so I'm going to start them off with a really hard question. Ready? And we definitely want for each of you to have an opportunity to answer these questions. So I'll kind of try to mix up who gets to go first. But here's the really tough question. And that is, I'd like you to pretend you're at a party and imagine you're standing at the veggie tray and someone asks you what self-sovereign identity is. Someone who has no idea what we do. How would you explain to them SSI? David, how about you start us off?
Certainly. Well, first of all, I would say that I don't like the term SSI. I think SSI is a really bad term. I think no man is an island. No man is self-sovereign. And in fact, if you open up your wallet today, your leather wallet, and you look inside at all the plastic cards you've got, you'll find that you did not create any of them. They were given to you by issuers, and those issuers can take them away from you when they want to. If you look at your passport, that's the same. Your driving license, that's the same. So I think self-sovereign is a really bad term because you're not self-sovereign. You're actually beholden to a whole bunch of issuers. Those issuers might be supermarkets, they might be airlines, they might be hotel groups, they might be the government, but they all issue you with credentials. Now, what verifiable credentials is saying we can turn all these plastic and paper credentials into electronic ones, and we can store them in electronic wallets. So I can still carry them around, but now they're much less bulky. I can't carry 100 plastic cards around with me. It's just not feasible, but I can very easily carry 100 verifiable credentials in an electronic wallet. And then I can present them to whoever I want to, whenever I want to. So that's the self in it. It's that I present whenever I want to, but I'm not sort of responsible for what I get because I have to rely on trusted issuers to give me those credentials. Now, the important thing is the standard for these, and the standard for these has been written up by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and that's the Verifiable Credential Data Model Standard. And that's the thing that binds and will bind all these different credentials together, because we can take all our existing plastic cards today, all our degree certificates, our passports and everything, and we can turn them into W3C verifiable credentials. So I would say to them, forget the term SSI. It's really a misnomer. It gives you the wrong idea. What we are about is turning all your existing paper and plastic-based credentials into electronic ones that you can store in a digital wallet on your smartphone and present when you want to whoever you want to.
Great, thank you. Luca, how about you?
Yes, I mostly concur with David, and I don't like the term as well. But I would also like to add that self-sovereign identity nowadays is a mainstream term, and it's widely adopted just to mean what has been described. It is mostly a paradigm. So in my perspective, we can think of that as something which is largely independent from the protocols, the formats, and whatever which comes behind below. In that case, I'm nowadays taking part in the discussion on the European identity wallet. And there are lengthy discussions here on what is the most appropriate format for for managing credentials in a self-sovereign identity mode. This includes verifiable credentials in W3C, say, specifications, but also MDoc, but also different formats which have been considered for that. So just let us distinguish between what is the paradigm, which almost everyone accepts under this term of sovereign identity, and what a technical implementation, which is another job.
Irene, how about you?
Yeah, I guess the definition that David provided was very much accurate to the story we tend to communicate to people outside of our community. I guess to provide additional information, the first thing I would do with this person is to ask who he or she does for a living. Because in understanding who that person is, you'll be able to surely define a use case that applies to that person and facilitates his or her life. So I tend to first, whenever someone comes to me and says, hey, what's Karaka? What's this like? What do you do? I always ask, okay, could you tell me a little bit more about yourself first? Because the story completely changes depending on who you're talking to. I guess if we're assuming it's a kind of regular person that has nothing to do with technology, but manages the internet on a daily basis, I think another analogy that I used to use to explain SSI is trying to put it as the next generation of identity model in the internet, coming back from centralized models where you subscribe to many different services by giving up on information, and you're in an essence creating siloed digital identities that only work for that specific service context, passing through an era where we had federated identities, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world that create an identity on our behalf, and we use that identity to sign up to different people. And then SSI, in those terms, is you becoming your own identity provider. So instead of you subscribing to services and generating an identity, a different identity for each one of those services, having those service providers subscribe to your own identity.
Great, thank you. I think the personalization of this work is going to be critical to mass adoption. We're going to have to tell those stories and make it relate. Dominic.
Yeah, let me try a slightly different approach, because those were all very, very good and holistic explanations. So when I'm at the supermarket and someone asks me, like my mom, a person like my mom or my grandma, I would typically take out my own wallet and then start to pull out cards and tell them, look, you got the driver's license already, you get your bus ticket and whatnot. So now imagine those cards are just digital. And now imagine the wallet is not a physical wallet made of leather, but it's on your phone. And then imagine you can show this to someone by just one click, right? And they can magically verify it and know they can trust you. So I think that's how I would typically generically try to explain it. Although I really like the approach of Irene, because I think you're completely right. People often think in use case, and that's probably the very best way to pick them up.
So Dominic, let's sort of stay on that theme then and take it from self-sovereign identity to the actual learning and employment record. How do you explain that to people?
Like anyone or someone in the education space?
I think your mom and your grandma at the supermarket. I picture the three of you like going through the aisles. So.
Oh yeah, okay. I see. Well, so in the education, so it's a bit difficult because my mom and my grandma, they did not do semesters abroad, and I think both didn't go to university. So that kind of narrows the scope of the use cases they're familiar with to stick with Irene's approach of telling people based on use cases they know. But I'd say, now you imagine you had something like like LinkedIn, where you collect all your, I think they know LinkedIn, something like LinkedIn, where you would connect all your or store all your identity information, and then you can just share it with a click to sign up for a university program or an e-learning program that you have, or if you decide to study abroad or go abroad, you don't have to go all the paperwork that I've been through, and can just very seamlessly take this all away. I don't think it's the biggest pain in that sense, but everybody who switched universities, I think, or switched countries to study knows that it's a little bit burdensome anyways. Or job applications, right? Filling out endless forms is quite horrible. So
definitely. Irene, tell us about learning and employment records for you. What do they mean, and how would you describe them?
Sure. So for me, learning and employment records is the first use case of SSI, or at least the most popular one, the one that probably will enable mass adoption of SSI, because it's in a certain way a low risk use case within SSI. So SSI intends to be, as you cited from my passion about SSI, it intends to be a universal digital identity, and as such, ID wallets are meant to include not only learning records, but many more different type of credentials. But the beauty about learning employment records is that it starts with a user base that is more technologically savvy than audiences in other use cases, and that are willing to try new things. So that's the beauty. And from a government perspective, if you want to start SSI in your country, the educational use case enables you to have a testing environment without going straight to the issuance of your national identity card. So for me, the learning and employment records is, of course, a very good use case to increase the talent and sharing talent worldwide and enable mobility among talents and workforce worldwide. But it is also a big and important use case to me, because it will probably be a big important enabler of SSI as a whole in a broader aspect.
Great, thank you so much. David, how would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I'd like to start by looking at it from a different perspective. Earlier in my career, I was the course director for a postgraduate course at the university. And so we got applicants from all over the world applying, and they had to show that they'd got a degree in order to qualify for the postgraduate course. Now, I knew about all the UK universities, obviously, because I'm from the UK, but I really didn't know about all the universities even in Europe. I knew some of the leading ones in Europe, but when it came to places like Turkey and India and Sri Lanka, I had no idea what the universities were, whether these degrees were genuine, because they were just pieces of paper. I didn't know whether they'd just been produced on some photocopier or whether they were a genuine degree from a genuine university. And so that was a major problem that all universities have. In fact, they've actually tried to solve this by having sort of clearinghouses, and you actually go to a clearinghouse and you ask the clearinghouse and they work it on your behalf. But once we move towards verifiable credentials, then the universities will offer their degrees as verifiable credentials, digitally signed by them, and it will be possible for me as a course director to actually get that verifiable credential and actually verify it. I won't need to ask anybody. I'll be able to verify it using my laptop in my office, and I'll be able to accept the student onto the course or not from their qualification. So that's a different perspective to show how valuable it's going to be and how it's going to speed up things, because to actually ask an external central organization if they know about this degree and if they know it's genuine or not, that takes them time. They're not going to respond within milliseconds. They're going to respond within weeks. And so it's going to speed up the whole process. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal, really.
I think both you and Irene have touched on the pain that universities or educational organizations and employers already have. Like this actually really solves a very real world problem for them. So I want to keep, I've got a lot of questions on this list and I'm paying attention to the time. So I'm going to start sort of maybe not having all of you answer every single one. But here's my next one. I'm going to hit you with it, Luca, first, which is, what are some of the practical applications of SSI and LERs that are happening right now in the UK and in Europe?
There are many initiatives around well, if we think of the wallet as the counterpart, digital counterpart of the leather wallet, which was mentioned, in fact, the education credentials are the digital counterpart of your drawer, where you keep all the degrees, you keep all the information that you got from from your previous employees, your curricula, etc. And in Europe, there are initiatives. The most widely known is probably the one which is under EPSI, under the head of EPSI, which is EPSI Diploma, where there's an exchange of a production of educational credentials in the format of verifiable credentials, which is consigned to the wallet of the users and then is spent around for say possible employees or employers of possible say other education, etc. There's another initiative that I would like to mention, which is just starting now. In fact, it's a funded project by the EU Commission, which name is Trace for EU. One of the use cases which is mentioned there is in fact the education credentials, leveraging not just the education credential, but lifelong education, including all what combines to be say the history, the education and professional history of people, and that would be experimented again under the EPSI ledger. There are many other initiatives around, but I'd just like to underline there's two major ones which I'm aware of, but I'm certain that other people can add many more.
Thank you. Those are two important ones. Dominic, what do you see as some of the practical applications being put into play?
Kimberly,
Yeah, so yeah,
sorry, let me just interject one sec, Kimberly, and I'm going to put a document link into the bottom of the chat there. And Luca, there's a series of EU technical references in a table at the bottom of the document. If you all could, at some point, either while on the panel or after, could check into that. And Luca, you said one resource that I hadn't captured before. So if you are able to confirm for us and add any additional technical resources that you think would be useful to share, then we would all greatly appreciate it.
It's funny when his picture is in here, it's sort of like the voice of God is like coming down. All right, so back to practical applications. You all know where to go and add in those, but Dominic, why don't you tell us about a couple that you're involved with?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we are working with businesses and use cases across different industries, but for today, where the focus, I think, is education and employment, I definitely confirm what Luca said about EPSI being, let's say, that the dominant SSI ecosystem in Europe, where diploma use case is the one that's pushed most. Then we got lots of great work being done in JFF in the US, which was interoperability testing between a number of wallet providers. We ourselves also tested and showed interoperability with a number of other SSI vendors and SSI wallets. So I think that was great. I believe it was the biggest SSI interop event so far, and that was in the context of education. And then you also have private ecosystems emerging that you could compare with EPSI, like the Velocity Network, which is also an SSI ecosystem focused on employment in that case. But obviously, education credentials are quite close here. And so I'd say those are three very, very strong ecosystems that are emerging. One private global, the other private in the US, the third one public sector driven in Europe. And then the use case itself, I mean, many different ones, but the obvious ones are obviously micro-credentials, diplomas, on the issuance side, student IDs, the provision of education wallets to individuals, and then also on the verifier side, things like job applications or applications to study programs. So yeah, I think a lot is happening here, and all of this looks very promising. And there's also even the first organizations that you see that are not SSI vendors, but are using SSI software to build vertical specific applications. So there's this one organization we're working with, or using our open source infrastructure to serve. I think this year, soon they're planning to go live with student wallets across Europe. And I think they already have 250 universities signed up, planning to put this into production sometime this year. So yeah, I think a lot is happening and it's very exciting.
You actually answered a question for me, which was sort of how is the adoption going, and 250 universities ready to issue onto student wallets sounds like a lot of really good adoption. So, if we think where we are right now, we have these projects and 250 universities are ready to start issuing, and we've got lots of wallets coming. If you think out 5 years from now, and what this world and what this space around LERs and SSI is going to look like 5 years from now, what do you think that looks like? Irene, do you have a thought?
Sure. I guess in order to answer this question, we should bring onto the table two other initiatives that are very relevant to the SSI community. One is, of course, eIDAS, the new eIDAS regulation, which in Europe is defining the issuance of ID wallets for European citizens by their central governments. And this legal framework, eIDAS, intends to cover many different use cases. In fact, the European Commission started with a tender that was granted back in December last year, the funding of 4 large-scale pilots. And those large-scale pilots are pilots where over 60 organizations in its consortium will try out different use cases under this new eIDAS legal framework. One of the consortia, for instance, is the Digital Credentials for Europe. And one of the 2 main use cases is academic diplomas. They involve over 70 organizations across almost all European countries. So those large-scale pilots are intended to be ready, full productive, results already delivered within 2 years. So if we look 5 years from now, definitely eIDAS will play a major role in making sure that the academic use case gets the mass adoption that it needs in the region. And the other thing is Europass. I think we should put that on the table too. So in Europe, there is this European Skills Agenda, which is a 5-year plan that will end in 2025. So 2 years from now. And within the European Skills Agenda, what they want is to essentially help individuals and businesses develop more and better skills and to put them to use. One of the main initiatives in Europe is Europass. And the beauty about all of these different initiatives around surrounding learning achievement records is that they are all converging into W3C verifiable credentials. For instance, Europass, their data model, which they will release their version 3 in March this year. They already publicly said that they will adopt the W3C verifiable credentials model. So what we are seeing is that all of these myriad of different initiatives that they're all trying to solve very specific problems surrounding this use case, they're all converging into SSI, ID wallets, W3C verifiable credentials. So I almost have no doubt that in 5 years' time, this will be already mass adopted.
Great. That's an exciting 5 years. David, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to be a little bit more cautious than Irene. I mean, if we look at some of the history, Europass was proposed in 2004, and the first system was released in 2012. And as Irene says, it's still not using VCs. They said they're going to move to VCs. The ESG, that produces the European standards and guidelines for higher education, that was agreed in 2005, and they still have not yet based it on VCs, on W3CVs. So I just would like to say, I don't think there'll be mass adoption in 5 years from now. I think definitely the first adopters will be there. I think it'll be used in pockets, but I don't think we'll be at the mass adoption stage in 5 years. I think it will still be the first adopters and the people who are leading the world. So I'd just be a little bit more cautious than Irene, I think.
So if you were painting the picture for 5 years, what do you think it will look like?
Well, I don't know, because you see, Apple and Google, they're supporting mobile driving licenses, and again, the ISO MDL standard has not yet agreed to use VCs. There's an annex in a draft, which is an informative annex, which says that we could go to VCs, but even that is not agreed. And there is some movement in ISO to even remove that. So it's still very much up in the air as to what the standard will be. And I don't think it will get mass adoption if we have different protocols, we have different formats, we have different cryptography, we have different resources for storing revocation lists and public keys and things like that. Mass adoption comes when there's one common set of standards that everybody uses. And if we look at mass adoption like email, that's the SMTP standard, which is very, very specific, and it nails everything down. And if we look at federated identity management, it's OpenID Connect, which again is pretty specific and nails things down. So until we can coalesce on one standard, I don't think we will get that mass adoption. The JFF Plugfest, which we participate in, and in fact, we actually interwork with Vault ID, and we showed interworking between our system and Vault ID. That used 3 different protocols, only 2 of which were successful. One of them didn't actually make it, which was DIDCOM. So, we're still not at that stage of everybody agreeing on one standard. So I just had a little bit of word of caution until I think the world can coalesce on one set of standards, it won't lead to mass adoption.
Kimberly, if I can interject here, because I think that, I think we're in the right segue. I mean, David, sounds like we need a technical standard for LER ecosystems, and that it should not be a new standard, but it should be a meta standard that curates and points to all of the incredible work that's been done over the last few years. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here together, right? So, really, I'll let you, yeah.
Could you scroll up so that we can see the recommended practices? Because we only have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to give each of the panelists a chance to sort of respond to, these 5 recommendations and how you feel like, is this the time to generally support them? Do you feel like there's significant edits that need to be made? I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that in conclusion. So Luca?
Yes.
You each have about a minute, 30 seconds to.
Oh, I'll be very short then. My perspective is very much from the perspective of the European digital identity wallet, which is the new thing that I see growing day by day, slowly, with difficulties, with many possible choices yet to be settled. But in this case, I think that education, and the development of education would be strongly, education credentials in Europe will be strongly linked and dependent on the identity wallet, since that will be probably the most relevant use case, the initial use case, which puts attention on many aspects which are important, especially understand whether the credential is valid. And that's the whole story which has been told before. How you know that the issuer was unable to act as an issuer and this kind of things. So the European Identity Wallet is going to settle all these issues, and education credential would be probably the most relevant case which will be used for testing it, and then leaving the space for other places. As for the recommendations, I think that I generally agree on them in this perspective. Even if, say, there are some comments which seems to be education specific, which we will try to make more generic in order to underline the fact that it won't be a different word. You don't want to have a word for education credential and a word for all of the rest. They would be share more or less the same infrastructure.
Thank you. Irene, how do you feel about these recommendations? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, my bad. I definitely, they align with what everyone within the SSI community understands must have as main components. The core use case that it intends to solve very much resonates with the concept and the paradigm that SSI tries to define. So in that sense, I think it's fully aligned. I feel very comfortable and it resonates a lot with me. Perhaps, I would have some very specific comments on a couple of the 5 points that are recommended. For instance, it provides some ambiguity in the sense of it invites to think that those credentials must be stored or locked actually on a blockchain network. And I would be very cautious about defining as a requirement that those credentials, in a sense, even the issuance process should be logged into a blockchain network. So I would kind of review that very specific point, but in general terms, I feel very much aligned with SSI.
Thank you. Dominic?
So I agree with Irene. So I'm also very much aligned, and picking up her point and maybe generalizing it a bit. Maybe sometimes it's not necessary to already write down how the exact technical implementation could look like, such as the example that Irene has given with regards to anchoring something on a blockchain, which especially in Europe, we all know is quite problematic, which is why also the EPSI version 2 conformance testing with wallets is required, and DID methods changed, and so on and so forth, to have everything off chain. And so I think as long as from a functional perspective, and I think that's the most important one that should be put forward, the recommendations are good.
David, you want to give us a final thought in 20 to 30 seconds?
Yeah, sure. I totally agree that those 5 principles are fine, apart from number 3. We should remove all reference to blockchain. Just by way of noting, there are about 30 organizations did JFF Plugfest, and not one of them were using blockchain. So I think we should remove that, which Irene first suggested. But apart from that, everything's great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Irene, I don't know if we have a chance for a question or two from the audience.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and thank you to all our panelists from panel 1. I must say that I've personally learned quite a lot about what's happening in Europe, and it's exciting to hear that there's actually a lot of momentum. That basically shows us that the work that we're doing is actually making impact, and definitely within 5 years, this technology should have enabled a lot when it comes to the identity and credentialing space. I don't know if there's anyone who would like to interact with our panel 1 panelists before we move to panel 2. If you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat, or you could raise your hand. Maybe from the chat, someone is asking, why not blockchain? I think one of the panelists mentioned that SSI might not necessarily be implemented using blockchain. So someone is asking, Jake Dibatitsa, why not blockchain? Who can take up that question? David?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think why not blockchain? Because blockchain is just one mechanism of many that can be used to store information that people are relying on. Blockchain really comes to the fore when you have a set of entities that don't trust it, and therefore they all have a copy of the information. So a good use case of blockchain is sets of banks moving money around, then they all have a copy of the money that's been moved around because they don't want to have some central source to trust for moving the money. But when we come to education potentials, we're actually in the situation where we are trusting universities, we are trusting the issuers of degrees, and we're not in the situation of not trusting each other. So and the other thing is blockchain is actually privacy invasive. If you put information on a blockchain that's publicly available to everyone, then how do you shield it? So that's another negative for blockchain. And then there's the performance issues, the fact that blockchains are very inefficient and use a lot of electricity, etc. So there are many reasons why I would not use a blockchain.
And Irene, I would just comment that thanks to David's input specifically, we have gone through a process of generalizing that functional technology so that blockchain can be used or not used, depending on the specific circumstances of the implementation. So I want to just thank David and acknowledge him for leaning in with us on that issue and helping us to focus the technical standard.
If I may complement just this answer, which is completely fine. In fact, there's a clear recognition that in order for this infrastructure, self-sovereign identity infrastructure to function, there's need of some central registry. Central by means publicly accessible. But the way this, and this has several functions, probably to identify whether issuers are allowed to, and this is the EPSI, what EPSI proved, to identify whether revocations are in place, to identify whether credentials are well properly defined, and so on. But this does not imply that this registry needs necessarily to be hosted by a distributed ledger or whatever. We have a functional specification for that, as was mentioned, but we can choose different technologies for that depending on what's the best option.
Okay, thank you so much, Luca. Thank you so much, David, Irene, and Kimberly, and Dominic. It's been such a pleasure having you. At this juncture, I would like to move to our next panel. We've heard what's happening in Europe, and now we would like to hear what's happening in Africa. And our next panel actually has people that have worked in Africa, have experienced, the SSI space, the identity credentialing space, and are definitely going to give us a bit of insight of what's going on, what it looks like in the future, and what we should expect. And at this juncture, I'd like to just hand over to Daniel to introduce our panelists today. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. And we have an amazing panel of folks that are going to be joining us today. I just lost my internet connection, which is one of the biggest problems that we often run into when it comes to communication. So Irene, if you could come back to me in just a minute, I apologize. I'm trying to get myself back set up here. So. Okay.
No problem, no problem. Daniel, I'll give you the role of wrapping things up after the panel, just to give our audience a brief about what has happened in the first panel and what has happened in the second panel. And let me get straight into introducing our panelists. So first we have Ms. Lucrezia Vitete. Lucrezia Vitete has worked in the IT sector in Uganda for over 10 years. And she has supported various digital transformation projects in identity, such as the integration between the Ugandan financial sector and the national ID system. And she currently works through GIZ with a D4D hub, an initiative by the European Commission and member states to drive inclusive digital transformation across Africa. Welcome to our panel today, Lucrezia. Then second on our panel is Mr. James Kivi. James is currently the CEO at JET Education Services in South Africa. He's an experienced poly researcher that has worked in South Africa, Africa, and internationally for the last 27 years. And his specific areas of expertise include qualifications, the recognition of learning, digitalization, and the professionalization and migration of teachers. Then lastly on our panel, we have Ms. Po Matsihidiso. Po, you'll forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, but Po is a professional development specialist at the University of South Africa, also known as the education technologist, who is passionate about integrating technology in education in institutions of higher learning. It's a pleasure to have you all today to share your expertise, and I believe that it's going to be a very informative discussion. So the first question I would like to bring forth, as people that are living in Africa and have worked in Africa, use a few examples that would be relevant to me as an African to explain the concept of self-sovereign identity. And I would like to begin with James. How would you explain self-sovereign identity in the African context?
Thanks, Irene, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody from South Africa. I think my response to that, Irene, would be that firstly, it's not well understood in many parts of the world, including South Africa. It's largely limited to techies, you know, and I was listening to the tail end of the previous panel. And, you know, so often we in the developing world, but also other parts of the world, jump from one thing to the next because it's the new hype. So I think my first response to you would be, we need to be careful as Africans and as a global community around just adopting SSI in how we operate and how we work. So firstly, it's limited to techies. Secondly, the SSI understanding in the world that I work is limited to a couple of rollouts at the moment. So there are some practical rollouts. So I heard the example just now of a mother and a grandmother. If you can't explain this stuff to your mother and your grandmother, you're really in trouble.
True.
And so for me, the real example that I often kind of use with this kind of stuff when I talk about SSI is about taking a CV and making sure your CV can be trusted, and also making sure that somebody can't access your CV without your permission. You know, as simple as that. And if we can get to a point as a global community where CVs are trusted and the technology enables us to make that trust manageable by the citizen in the country, then I think we've got a very simple explanation of SSI without going into the details of using the blockchain or anything else around it. There are two instances in South Africa, very briefly, that I can talk to. There's an instance that is run by UNICEF that is going into Africa that is using SSI very significantly. It's called YOMA, Y-O-M-A. A very important initiative. There's a second initiative that is more local in the country that I live, South Africa, and it's called the PSET Cloud, P-S-E-T-C-L-O-U-D. Both of these you can just Google and you'll find a lot of information. Both of these have similar backends using the SSI protocol to enable us to develop a technology stack that enables us to look at credentialing and linking, in particular youth, to employment opportunities. So I can go on for a long while, but let me stop there, Irene. I can come back so I don't take too much airtime, but I can talk more about this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kibi. And I really like when you say that sometimes we need to be careful not to jump with the hype, but we need to understand what the hype is about and what it really takes to implement that hype. Lucrezia, how would you explain to your grandmother what SSI is?
Thank you, Irene. I think actually you're the one who put it very nicely in another webinar we attended together. I mean, here in Uganda, where I've been living for the last 13 years, most children actually keep like a box or a file at their parents' house with all their documents from primary school and secondary school on and so on. And then of course there's like a flood and the house gets wet and everything gets wet, or you know, they move and they forget to carry along the file, and then whenever they need these documents, which are very often needed, especially when you are applying for a job, sometimes you actually even have to bring the original, especially in government positions. You, of course, you can imagine, I mean, many people then can associate with the headache of having to go back, physically travel to the university where you went, standing in line and waiting for hours and days and weeks to get a replica of this document, and so on. So I think it's important to use situations that people can relate to. And I just want to bring up another situation which is coming out more and more now as well, which is the gig economy. So we have more and more young people, especially, that get freelance jobs over, technology platforms. And again, there's always sort of a challenge with their credentials, because this is now, a global economy, and people from really far away need to have some trust in your skills and your abilities. So this is also a use case I think more and more young people can relate to. How do you share your credentials with these platforms in a trusted way? And not only, and in the tech world, of course, it's not only university degrees, but also all these little badges and small certificates that you're getting when you're doing some online courses or upskilling courses, which are all valuable and they add on to your profile. I think that's pretty much how I would explain it, and I think many people would be able to relate.
Yeah, definitely. I do relate to that. I always think of the heart attack I would get if my documents got banned. Whoa, it would be crazy. Chidi, over to you. How would you explain this concept, SSI?
Explaining the concept SSI to my grandmother, it will be me using the examples of their context. We are in Africa, and over the years, I've learned that sometimes we jump onto the technology bandwagon, and after we jump and we support the Europe or the USA, we are left on our own to fend for ourselves. So explaining the concept, it will to say, I can be on my own, I can want to be on my own, but I should not lose my values. Because even if I have to look at to look at being a SSI, I also have to consider myself a member of the society. There are advantages, yes, to having to use the concept, which can help to a certain extent in Africa. However, if the implementation is not done correctly, or we just jump because out of excitement, that's where we will get problems. I will use an example of how I used to assist some students when they were, for them to submit their dissertations or their chapters of their dissertations to save them on even on their emails. I was using the concept of, what if you get marked? We know there is crime, you carry your backpack, and then what will happen to your dissertation chapters? Why not back up your work online, and then so that should anything happen, then you have you have the backup that you can use, rather than to start from the beginning? Or what if the device that you are using, like, remember we started with the floppy disks, and then we end up having the USBs, the 12 megabytes USBs. What if it gets infected with a virus? What will you do? And it created that the confidence that I see we can use for SSI. However, it should not be pushed down to Africans. If we are to say we are going to help to integrate, or we are going to adopt maybe the standards, we should ensure that it becomes a collaborative effort, because now the world has changed. We have changed how we are doing things, and some standards or some of the concepts that we are bringing with regard to technology, they should be incorporating the African context. We should not be always the Africans to be trying to adopt and adapt. It should be like the development based on what is happening now, that everything it incorporates where it incorporates us and it meet us where we are, and the skills that we have in the continent can also be brought into the picture so that everyone is assisted, and then we collaborate and we have ownership of whatever technology we will be bringing on board. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Shudi. And two things are picked from your submission. One, we need to understand the concepts to be able to implement them well enough. Two, whatever concepts, whatever technologies they are, they shouldn't just be, you get something from Europe and just dump it, but rather we work together to make it adopt to our environment, to the people, so that it can easily be adopted. And that brings me to my next question. When we look at adoption of SSI and understanding, what are your comments about some of the companies that have, you could say, fairly moved towards the implementation of SSI-enabled platforms in the right way? And James, I could begin with you.
Sure. I think, Irene, the point for us in Africa is that there's a strong commercial intent behind the use broadly of technology, but also of SSI in our countries. Our governments are a little bit slower to catch up with these kind of things. That's the reality. And so what I found, and we work with many governments across Africa, including the African Union, is that you've got a lot of commercial players coming from northern countries that are kind of selling things that should be free. And they're selling them to countries, and they put licensing things and cost into it and embed the cost, that many of these governments get caught up in the cost associated with the tech. Now, the one major difference, and we've got a lot of northern colleagues on the call with us today, in many northern countries, a lot of the work happens in a very decentralized, very private sector kind of driven way, and government eventually adopts. In the world that I live, governments are much more centralized. They have much more say around what happens in the countries. And of course, they're slower, just like in any country, governments are slower. So our difficulty is the ability for the private sector to move quicker and to do things is more limited. And therefore, you get the sense of things being sold to governments because, there's this commercial intent behind it. So I think the real key thing for us around African countries is to talk more to each other, to talk to initiatives that are continental. For example, the one initiative that's happening at the moment continentally is called the African Continental Qualifications Framework. This is very similar, if you would know about the European Qualifications Framework or initiatives that are happening in other parts of the world. So the ACQF is in its third year of development. And as a continent, we're coming together and talking about the new innovations around credentials, LERs, as well as blockchain-driven initiatives like SSI. So I mean, both CD and Lucrezia spoke to this a little bit. This is not about African countries not wanting to embrace the technology. It's about African countries not wanting to be exploited. And so the reality here is, let's have the conversations and let's have them in a meaningful way, because quite often our countries, because we're so centrally driven with our governments, tend to kind of purchase things that should be free. So maybe that's a key point. I hope it's a little bit controversial, and I hope people want to respond to it. Thanks, Irene.
Okay, thank you so much, James. Collaboration is key, and one of the things I like about the work that we do is we are bringing all the voices together in one space to share, to see how we can together move these technologies to benefit us all. Lucrezia, what are your comments?
Yeah, I think James has already highlighted some very interesting trends. Of course, there are a couple of things that are happening. I will just mention some very few. Of course, there is startup, like tech startups, of course, are often leading the way, like it was mentioned, but of course, it's sort of a smaller scale, like Diwala, where I'm also a board member. Yoma, I'm happy it was mentioned because GIZ has also been part of that. And the GIZ also has a learning platform called Atingi, which is now also going towards the direction of adopting SSI. And also I wanted to mention another initiative that could be very beneficial for Africa in the same sense that James has said. So as GIZ also, we are very invested in something called the Digital Public Goods Alliance, where basically both standards, approaches, and code is made available for free after it has been verified by, certain or vetted by a certain committee. This means that in principle, a lot of this tech that is being sold to Africa, it could actually be obtained for free. It is shared for free, and I actually checked on the registry, and there are a couple of solutions of digital wallets, SSI wallets, based on blockchain, not based on blockchain, many different open, standards and code that is already available. That can be used. Now, of course, I think the challenge is in Africa is, of course, the skills and the competencies to actually make use of these resources in a good way. In GIZ, we have another project called GovStack, where we are trying to use the digital public goods approach to build building blocks, not of code, but of specifications and standards. Because as you all know, a lot of time is often wasted in the development of specifications in government institutions, but we're encouraging them to use open standards and specifications, and then of course they can choose whichever vendor or how they would like to implement this. So I think there is a lot of potential to get access to this technology in a cheaper way than what is often thought about. But of course, like I said before, it's really about building the skills, especially in government institutions, to be able to take advantage of all of this. And then, of course, I think when we are looking at implementation in Africa, of course, we do have some really different realities here compared to Europe that really have to be taken into account. For example, the fact that most students will actually not own their own device. They might have to access their wallets from 3 or 4 different devices, lending parents smartphones or computers, things like that. The fact that a lot of learning institutions cannot afford to put together registries and things like that. I think when we are going to think about how these standards are going to be implemented in Africa, we really need to try to think of ways where the investment that each learning institution has to put in place to join has to be as minimal as possible, and the same for the students. So I think those are just some of my thoughts, Irene.
Yeah, very, very good thoughts. And I must say that these problems are real. Working with Diwala and seeing, issues around internet accessibility, around devices, around payments, these problems are real. And I just have a special question for Paul. With all these issues that we have talked about that are real issues, do you think there is a future for SSI 5 years from now? How does it look like?
There is a future for us in Africa, and the future it will be if maybe we collaborate. When we say we, I'm looking at the institutions of higher learning in Africa, both public and private, collaborate to have some of the courses, or develop some courses or modules which we might make them free to introduce the concept, and then from there look at how the schools are also implementing the technology and see if we can go down to the school. So we can decide if maybe as institutions of learning, higher learning, do we develop for the schools, or do we start developing for our unemployed youth and taking our challenges into consideration when we develop this type of technology, the issues of technology, the issues of power to electricity to power the devices, the issue of the skills and competences for the participants, and also the capability of the institutions. Will we be able to handle the demand should we succeed? But there is a future for us in Africa to be able to implement SSI, but in looking at it in an African context, that no man is an island. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it does bring a smile to my face. There is a future for SSI in Africa. Lucrezia talked about the standards, and at this juncture, I just want to ask Greg to pull up the standards. And one of the things that I picked from Lucrezia is, if we're building standards, they also need to have at the back of their minds, at least, the challenges in Africa, the reality of Africa. And I believe James, Lucrezia, Paul, you've had a chance to look at these standards extensively. And I just would like for you to just give us a few comments about the standards. What do you think about them? Do you think there's something missing? Do you think they can push the adoption of SSI in Africa? And I would like to begin with James.
Irene,
your comments on the standards.
Irene, if I could just interject quickly, though, first. Yeah. So this is a slightly different picture than the one that we showed at the panel, the first panel. So this is the same standard, but this is a different view. And I want to credit Eric Shepard for contributing this sort of simplification of the view. And so it's the same ideas where you have the awarder, who is typically the educational institution. And they or their transmitter, which is typically their technical partner, make sure that all of the credentials of learning are first registered in some type of a shared service, so that future entities don't need to go back and get that data, that there's some type of a shared service for that. And then when the awarder transmits the verifiable learning and employment record to the holder, who can hold it in their digital wallet, they are able to present it to a future reviewer. And that could be a job applicant tracking system or an education system, or it could be a tutor who's attempting to better personalize the learning experience for a student. And that is 100% controlled, thus self-sovereign, by the holder. So the holder is saying who gets to see what parts of the record. Irene, I think maybe we can kind of wrap up this panel with sort of reaction to, what do you think of this picture? The recommendations, do you feel like we're in general on the right track here? Or are there any, warning signals that you have that you think that we're not paying attention to sufficiently, or anything like that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg. And James, we could start with you.
Thanks, and thanks, Greg, for the intervention. So a couple of comments. I think the logic, it's not rocket science, guys. So the logic of SSI and what we're talking about is being used increasingly internationally. So for me, the real issue here is really around contextual stuff and governance as well. So a couple of comments on the picture, Greg, and thanks. So the awarder, of course, can be an employer as well, not only an education provider, and I think that's increasingly important. I think interesting enough, many of our African countries have centralized, well, I mustn't exaggerate too much, let me say some African countries have centralized repositories of these learning and employment records. You'll be surprised how many of them actually have this. It's still using old tech, conventional mechanisms of verification. But the interesting thing is the potential that those repositories have for us to overlay it with the new technology is massive. Because guess what? They already centralized. Now, this is a bit of a contradiction because, of course, we're moving to a decentralized system. But of course, somewhere you've got to start with the data set and getting the permissions. And
Yes.
so, but South Africa, I can talk about South Africa. We have for the last 25 years had a centralized repository of learner records, not learner and employment, but learner. So we have millions and millions of records on there. You know, there's such potential there. And the qualification authority, who's not with us today, but hopefully listening, is looking at about bringing some of this new thinking in, because they're actually sitting with the gold mine around the data. What they need to do is they've got to link it to new protocols and new standards. A really important point that was made just now is, you know, we need this meta standard for us to get the kind of critical mass around the understanding of what you guys are talking about today. Now, the question in Africa is, where does the standard come from, these common standards? In the African context, the common standards do not necessarily come from the private sector. The common standards actually come more from government views or regional economic communities or African Union or other things like that. So I'm completely aligned with the work you're doing. I think the standards where you're going around this is very much in sync with what we're doing. My question is not so much about the logic of what you're presenting. My question is about who owns the logic, who's setting the standard. In our context, the standard setters are really important. In our context, we work extensively with global agencies, particularly at the moment with the ILO and UNICEF, around looking at 3 sets of standards. And Irene, I'll stop if I'm going on too long. Firstly, we're looking at international normative standards, particularly for credentials. Now, of course, credentials can be utilizing the SSI protocol and the logic that you guys are presenting to us. We're looking at open technology standards for these credentials as well. And thirdly, we're looking at the forms of governance that are best suited to this. The governance we're exploring with is decentralized autonomous organizations. So DAOs offer something to governments that give them a foothold in the decision-making, but does not take away the right of the citizens to kind of manage these kind of systems. So my response, Greg, would be broadly around, it's not about the logic of the standards. This is broadly going in the right direction. My question is about who owns the standards and who sets the standards. Those are the big questions. Thanks, Irene.
Irene, if I could just very quickly, just for James, you know, we do want to say owned by IEEE and created by us, right? And so now we could create this in W3C, we could create this in ISO. There could be we picked IEEE because it seemed like it was the most globally. We also looked at the Linux Foundation. We've been kind of looking for a home for this, and we think IEEE is a good neutral home. But you know, we really welcome everyone's participation. We know that part of the next phase of this is to move from technical standards to implementation technologies, and we need a home for that implementation. The whole open source movement and the connection between open source and open standards that lowers the cost. So you can pick up open source, you can use open standards, and you can start going much more quickly.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg, and very pertinent questions for us to think about, James. Lucrezia, do you think the standards cater to the challenges in Africa, like you mentioned?
Yeah, I think overall, I think the main components are really there. I tend to agree with James that I think the struggles are going to be around governance, legal frameworks, and ownership, because in many countries, some of these registries, or there are even authorities, government authorities that are managing these registries and so on and so forth. And even the big public universities have very specific departments and their own regulations on how these registries are managed. For me, I don't know so much about the details about this in the academic world, but my gut feeling would be to really go a little bit deeper into the relationship between the awarder and the transmitter. Those two, I think they're in Africa going to look very different from in other places. There will be a couple of constellations and things that you could then look at and see how best that could be resolved, because I think that is a key relationship, and I don't see it so clearly how that is going to be easily implemented on the ground.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucrezia. Paul, what do you think of the standards?
I agree with Lucrezia and James, and I am more concerned also like here on the issue of the transmitter and the awarder, and with governance, the governance and also how institutions like individual institutions are interpreting even the set standards that we are having currently and implementing them. A lot of work and consultations will need to be done in relation to that, and also looking at other, like in South Africa, we have professional bodies that are setting standards, also have their own standards, and they have their own criteria of the skills and competencies that they also need the students to, the students to have, and what and also what their candidates for employment also needs to bring to the workforce, like the graduate attributes. So lots and lots of work will need to be done on the ground for us to customize the standards and to fit to try and make it accommodative of our of the context of us in Africa. But I'm not, even if I'm saying the context of Africa, it's not like I'm saying we don't want to expand. We can still expand, but I'm looking at advocating for our communities in Africa, so that we don't have anything that is too rigid or too standard, because should someone present this somewhere, we might see it being someone running with it, and then without due diligence, and then it is brought down to institutions, or even to us to say, then this is what you have to run with. Like we were saying, some things become buzzwords for 2 or 3 years, and then after that we get a new buzzword again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And at this juncture, I just want to ask if anyone has a question. Greg, are there any questions in the chat?
Well, I think maybe if we could ask Dan to synthesize what he's heard so far in this first 2 panels and help
Absolutely, Greg.
transition.
Thank you so much. And Irene, thanks for stepping up earlier. I finally got everything back working. So what I've heard is that there's a lot of interest in how this applies in the African context. Giving ownership, mobility, interoperability to people, regardless of what country or region or zone they're living in, is really powerful. But if we are to have learner education records, comprehensive learner records, whatever we want to call these, be a form of currency, of learning currency, we want to make sure that we don't end up with what's happened with cash and credit, where you've got hard currencies and soft currencies, where we set up these tiers. We need to respect the local context and have the power grow from the learner up. We also need to acknowledge, and I heard this begin to be touched on, that there are financial interests who right now make significant profit from owning other people's data and having people pay for them. And that we need to work to make sure that if a student puts in the effort to earn a credential, that they actually have the right to that in a fee-less system moving forward. If we're gonna have, we moved from cash to e-cash, where now we've got Apple Pay and Google Pay, and it took us time to get there. But eventually we have transactions that can be flowing, a reduced friction in how people obtain goods and services. The analogy for learner records is opportunities and access. We need to promote equity globally by ensuring that whatever standards get deployed are not done in a tiered system. So there's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of reasons to worry, but we also know that what this can do is actually unleash lots of opportunity locally, regionally, and globally. So Irene, I'll hand it back to you.
Yep. Thank you so much, Daniel. I couldn't have put it any better. And thank you to our panelists that have handled our second panel question very, very good. You've got us thinking even more, and this is what makes our work exciting. It's challenging, but we always eventually find a solution. Now, our third panel is now going to focus on how we can work together, how we can enable the sharing of data across continents, how Africa and Europe can come together to ensure that the standards that we've built, to ensure that the technologies that we have built actually go ahead and get implemented and can be used by all. And at this juncture, I would just like to introduce Richie to tell us more about herself and tell us about our panelists today.
Thanks so much, Irene. This was a really stimulating conversation so far, so glad to be here. I'm Vriti Saraf. I'm the founder of K20 Educators. We're a metaverse building space. We architect meta spaces. And then I'm also the co-founder of Ed3 DAO. It's the first DAO for educators, hoping to catalyze innovation in education. So I'm really excited to introduce panel number 3. We're going to talk about the interaction between Africa, Europe, and data exchanges. And our panelists are Snorre Luther van Goren Edwin, who's a co-founder and CTO of Dewala. We have Jessica Jane Nell, who's a curriculum specialist at University of South Africa, and Dr. Phumza Makato Kunu, who's the Deputy Director of ICT, University of South Africa. And facilitating this will be Greg, who you all know already. So I'll hand it over to him.
And I am just looking for Snorre here in the spotlight. Yeah. Is he here?
I'm in the space.
Yep. Okay. Sorry for the clumsiness here. You're in the space, just not finding you alphabetically. Turn on your camera, Snorre, and hopefully that'll.
It's on. I have a space background. It's purple a little bit.
Okay, there we go. I see you there. Add to spotlight. And
awesome.
Good. Okay. So we've heard some very interesting things so far. I think you all were on and listening. So I think we can jump right into your reactions to what you've heard so far and where you see the future of this work going. We wanted to particularly focus on a scenario of movement between Africa and Europe, movement of people, movement of talent. We talked on our prep session about the idea of if someone were to go from Europe to Africa or Africa to Europe, and they were to show up in an airport and they wanted to fly a particular type of plane or helicopter, what would you need to know about that person to trust them in the pilot seat? And what if it's not a pilot? What if it's hiring a cybersecurity engineer from some place that you don't know, where you have no local contacts or references that you can trust, but you want to know whether you can trust whether they have those skills? Or what if it's a nurse or a teacher or anything else in the talent marketplace? So if you guys can, feel free to, whoever would like to start, jump right in. And what's your reaction to this? And what do you think would be necessary in order to support that type of global marketplace for skills-based talent?
You go first, no.
So I've been thinking about this, like everything that's been spoken about now with the wallet and VC and education, being able to transport with the user is really critical. But one thing that is the most difficult part here is the trust. Like, how can I trust that that thing comes from something that has some kind of reputation? That makes sure that the people who has educated this person in helicopter, or actually the helicopter situation is very clear, because you could have, I assume that there's very clear structures of who are allowed to educate helicopter pilots. when it comes to cybersecurity and more a little bit nuanced skills, it's quite difficult to nail it down to one certificate. So it's, but it brings us back to the subject of trust framework, which is the most complicated thing I know in this space, because you can just say it's a list, or you can start to dig deeper into it and talk about democratized voting, reputation, and so on and so on. So it's a super complicated field, but it's one that needs more work and that needs to come in place for us to be able to trust education from a country we don't have the knowledge about.
Jessica, do you want to jump in?
Yes, see, I was listening to the panelists and I was thinking of it from two perspectives. I definitely latched onto the governance side of things because for me, that's where you have the intercontinental trust happening. We are blessed in South Africa that we have our Council of Higher Education, we have the South African Qualification Authority, we have our National Qualifications Framework. So everything is beautifully laid out in detail. As Dr. Kiwi was saying, there's millions of records as well. So we have the data. But something that I've often pondered about when it comes to the credentials is, and I'm a big proponent of open education and recognition of prior learning. And that's something I don't want to get lost in all of this. When in Africa, we have a different style of education that can take place. It is not just the higher education space. We have a lot of informal learning taking place. So how do we bring that into these standards? Who's going to recognize that informal learning that takes place? So that is a question that I think we need to ponder about a lot. And then I think of, what does our SAQA database look like? Every single higher education institution will submit their curriculum through the Council of Higher Education, have it registered on the SAQA database if approved, and you will be able to see what are the assessment criteria, what are the outcomes, which institutions are offering this, for example. So that's actually where we need to look at is, let's focus on those outcomes, those assessment criteria, and see. I mean, I was looking at it today. Everyone puts in their own, and then those institutions offering this qualification, there's only one. But there's a lot of overlap if you start to look between qualifications, what they're offering. So we definitely need that central governance, and we also need to be able to open it up so that multiple providers can speak to that assessment criteria, can speak to that specific outcome and offer evidence thereof. But who is going to judge that evidence? So I was thinking to myself, there's a space that I think we need to look at is, who will assess evidence so that we can verify that this student from the University of Johannesburg or this student from Noun in Nigeria, they are meeting the same assessment criteria for that set standard. But I'll let one of my other colleagues come in now.
Dr. Magato Kundu, welcome. And, do you trust what's in this central database in South Africa, and how do people outside of South Africa trust what's in the South African Learning Record Store? And how do you trust something coming from a neighboring country or from Europe or from any other country? What are your thoughts?
Okay, thank you and good evening, colleagues. For me, I would align myself with what Jessica has just said, governance. I think governance would be very important for us to be able to implement and to trust. And then something again that gives me comfort, especially when I was looking at this standard that we are here about, was the fact that there is the verifiability. One is able to verify the credentials that are cryptographically signed. That's what gave me a little bit of comfort to say if it's cryptographically signed, it means it cannot be changed. No one can change it. The person who's, what do we call them? The marketplace will have to verify. That's what gave me comfort. And then again, I was actually, colleagues, very happy to see this. Why am I saying that? Because in 2020, during COVID, I attended one workshop. It was with the colleagues from Canada, which was speaking a blockchain in education. I was very much confused coming out of that workshop because all I could hear was financial terms, and my understanding was that this thing cannot work in education. But seeing this standard, it said to my mind that this thing it's doable, it's possible. And then, yes, I can say I would also want to align myself with what was presented by CD and James, the collaborative effort. I think as Africans, we would need to, there's a proverb which says better late than never. We would not like to jump into this because currently we are inundated with the fly-by-night institutions. Never mind, we are having our SACA, we are having our Council for Higher Education frameworks and policies. We are inundated with that. So what I can say is that verification, policies and frameworks that are guiding the standard, trustworthiness, that's where we would need to begin. We would need to start with the basics, because I'm afraid if we don't start with the basics, we are just going to be excited, adopt, and finally find ourselves in big trouble because we would have just jumped into things instead of maybe being slow and then learning, doing research, being trading very carefully before we can adopt and implement. Yes, I agree, it is a great initiative, but I think there's a whole lot of loopholes and gaps that need to be attended to first. Thank you, Greg and colleagues.
Thank you. Riti, do you want to respond to what you heard so far? Maybe any next direction for the panel?
Sure. Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions, obviously, with this work that we need to answer. So Snor, first brought about the question of trustworthiness. So Phumza, what you were saying was, it's great that these things are verified, but the agency that's verifying them still needs to be trustworthy. So how do we trust that agency, especially if there are many of them? And how do we ensure quality across those agencies? And then Jessica's point, which is, there is a lot of informal learning happening out there, and how do we actually acknowledge that? Perhaps it's through performance-based assessments or something like that. So I think the question here is, for me, is, what are the steps we need to take in order to start to address some of these gaps and some of these loopholes that you just mentioned are taking place? Maybe it's a process, maybe it's a system, maybe it's a pre-step, but what is that pre-step that we need to take to make that happen?
You ask a difficult question. I think this is where we have this going around and around over and over again, because we've got lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is not just formal learning. It is open educational resources. It is massive open online courses. It is what you learn on the job through experience, and how to verify that that has taken place, which speaks to the fact that we do need some organization or some body whose main job is to take this evidence of learning, be it in portfolios of evidences, online e-portfolios of students, and verify that this actually matches the assessment criteria within the official formal learning space so that you can recognize that learning. And that also opens up the doors for articulation so that these students who were maybe prevented access, be it through sociocultural barriers, are now afforded access into the system. Because that was my key concern looking at this, is it is all digital. And we have a massive digital divide in Africa. So how are we going to bring our learners with us? And then something I don't want people to forget is we shouldn't just prescribe on our learners. Each of these badges, each of these credentials is a representation of that person's identity. Now, we were talking about the self-sovereign identity in these previous panels. And some were for it, some were against it, but it was from an ICT perspective. I'm talking about it from what does this credential mean for that person? It is a representation of their goals, who they want to be. So yes, they do need to have ownership of it, and very importantly, have recognition of it, because recognizing it is recognizing their identity. I see myself as an educational technology lover. So I need to have credentials that back that up. So when I go overseas, yes, I can have my formal verification happening, but I want you to also think about what can the learner do? What can the learner hold ownership over? And we're seeing it already today with spaces like LinkedIn, with personal blog spaces. People are creating their own entire online portfolios of who they are as an employee, who they are in the labor market, who they are in the gig economy. That was also mentioned by one of our panelists. So how are you going to manage that? What's nice is we worry about how do we trust that this credential is verifiable in another continent. The learner does have ownership over that. They provide the evidence, they host their portfolio of evidence so that a potential employer can go in and see what this person has done. So there is a pathway we can start to look at when it also comes to recognition of prior learning.
Dr. Magatakanu, do you want to pick up on that? Of how would you, if you were accepting a student into your program, what would you want to know about them if they came from someplace outside of South Africa in order to, in order to place them appropriately on their pathway to your program completion? What do you need to accept or not accept? Transfer credentials from another place that you might not have a relationship with.
It was a question to our colleague, right?
Yes, Dr. Magato, are you there?
The question is directed to who?
To you, yes. Maybe I'm
Oh,
mispronouncing your name. I'm sorry. Yes, to you.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you kindly repeat the question? I thought the question is for Snow. Thanks.
So you are director at a ICT program, right, in your university. And so my question was to you is, as you think about applicants into your program from other places across the globe, what would you want to know about them in order to better place them into the right place on their personal pathway to program completion?
Okay, thank you, Greg. Thank you, colleagues. I would obviously want to place them relevantly, number one. I would also like to know the skills that they are having, because if one is not relevantly placed at a workplace, for an example, that wouldn't benefit them that much. That's how short I can answer that question. I wanted to also jump into the question on the chat, which says, should these credentials expire and need re-evaluation as the world evolves? Yes, I believe the credentials should have an expiry date, because remember, with technology, there's a whole lot of changes. Currently, we were talking of this generative pre-trainer transmitter 3, GPT. We are now talking GPT-4. So I agree that the credentials should expire and be renewed after a certain number of years or so. Thank you.
Snor, do you want to pick up on the GPT-3, GPT-4, and predict the future for us about?
I really hope that people embrace it, because it's like everyone wants to become more efficient, right? And it is going to make us more efficient. But the thing about what we really then delve into is the core understanding of things, like the principles. Go back to the root principles, because that's where we as humans can really, like, we can see the principles and we can fantasize. Machines cannot fantasize. We can create stories that doesn't exist. Machines cannot. So basically, I really hope you embrace this tool. It's going to be super powerful and really interesting. Unfortunately, it's going to affect a lot of people. But for me, it's all about leaning in and not blocking. When it comes to the skills and verification part of things, it's a reality that it comes down to these uncategorized skills, critical thinking. I know that Jessica has probably a lot more words around this space than me, but these skills are the ones that we have to be able to identify. And it's also something that has been very passionate for Dwala. We haven't been able to get there yet, but a way for kind of, while we let educators issue credentials, we can also utilize this data and the framework they kind of base themselves on to kind of populate these undocumented credentials in some kind of way. Because then you get to see the real power of the person behind it. Then you can understand this person is actually able to use ChatGPT to do his work 100 times faster than that person who doesn't have these other skills. But it's super complicated, because we today understand, yes, put them behind a test, they are able to cram all that information in, reply to it and say, I got 100%. Sure, you're a lawyer. But past that, it's super difficult, unfortunately.
Well, so these assessments are often come from a standpoint of equity, but then end up having the reverse effect, right? And these standards like critical thinking all too often become a shorthand for someone I know, or someone that I know, or someone that looks like me, right? And how do we get to more of a more equitable global marketplace where people everywhere around the world are able to blossom and access opportunity more equally than based so much on networks of local relationships?
That's you hit the nail on the head there. So something we see a lot of in higher education is the outcomes-based learning outcomes and outcomes-based education. And what's taking rise, and which is also leading to your micro-credentials a lot more of, is your competency-based assessments. So if you look at something like the McKinsey framework for the real world of work, it outlines 4 different quadrants of different types of skills, creativity, problem solving, critical thinking. Those are the ones you're after, Snor. And we're actually trying to do that at UNISA as it is. We've got a big gap to fill, however. We have a project at the university, the Academic Development Open Virtual Hub, whose sole aim really is to upskill and prepare students for the 4th industrial revolution. I don't like the term myself. I think we are on a sliding scale, as it were, and we can jump around it as much as possible. But again, I think when it comes to skills, competencies, that is something that can only be proven through actual evidence. And we got to think a little bit out the box here now. An exam paper is great. It might show your ability to quickly recall what you read. What we're looking at now is your GPT. How are we going to bring that in? Great, now we can take something like GPT and an essay written by GPT and take an essay written by an actual person and ask your students to now compare this and evaluate it and bring up this very reflective, thought-provoking essay on how they would compare and which one they actually think has been written by a human. Now you're getting the person coming across here. So for me, and you would have picked it up when I talked right back to the person hosting their own evidence, it's about authenticity in the end. It's really about authenticity. And some people, when I say authenticity, will think of proctoring. And when I speak of authenticity, I mean true to the person in terms of their lived experience, a portfolio of their lived experience. I come from a music background, creative industries background. So the gig economy really, really spoke to me there because we have a lot to learn from that space. Our poor, downtrodden musicians and artists and fine artists and ballerinas, but they have a lot of knowledge to share. And they function exclusively on their portfolios. And I think that that's something we need to start teaching learners how to create this entire digital portfolio. And again, we're going to have to then also teach our learners who do not have the ICT skills how to create something like that, because that is where the currency is. It's in the online environment at the moment.
Awesome. Rudy, you want to give us a focus to take to complete, or Dr. Magato Kanu, do you want to, who's got an idea for what we should, how we should close up this set of panels?
I think coming also from the ICT background, for me, having standards is very important. And looking at this standard, I checked most of the documents that were visited. I saw that there were a whole number of standards visited. I think that's what also impressed me, because honestly, I was impressed. So for me, coming from that background, I believe having a standard that says this should look like this, it's very important.
Yes, I'm just referring to here in the appendix of how many technical standards are integrated into this standard. Yeah.
Yes. So for me, that is very important, because it will always guide correctly. It will always tell us what is wrong, what is right, where is a gap, which gaps do we need to fill. So yes, in a nutshell, I can say that. And yeah, collaboration as well. As an African in South Africa, I think it would be best for us to collaborate with Neuro, not forgetting the Europeans, not forgetting that South Africa, we're still struggling with electricity. Colleagues, we're still struggling with data. It's very much expensive. Hence, I opened with the proverb, better late than never. So the most important thing is just the sharing, for me, is the sharing of the best practices, communication, maybe bodies whereby we collaborate on such bodies. And finally, what I see as a weakness in higher education institutions, relevant people sharing best practices, or relevant people collaborating, because it puzzles me to find that as a head for now, professional development, ICTs, instead of me going to a Moodle conference, you find that my higher up senior person is the one who's attending. And I'm asking myself, because it's me who's the implementer, I'm supposed to be going there to learn, to network, I think that also we need to just look at it with a critical eye and prioritize that the relevant people attend relevant networks and collaborations. And as an individual, I'm looking forward to be collaborating with you, colleagues. Thank you.
That's excellent. And maybe Vriti, I want to maybe if you can kind of pull this all together, because I think that there's a question of, okay, so we publish this technical standard, it literally becomes a PDF, right? And then what, right? Well, there needs to be a then what, right? And some of the then what is that list of resources that I showed in the back. Our intent is to create an open source database of those resources that once a quarter checks in for the maturity level of each resource. Is that a good idea? That's not been implemented? Has it been piloted someplace? Has been implemented 3-5 places? Has it been implemented 100+ places? And so Vriti has been developing something called a distributed autonomous organization, a DAO. And the idea is that these judgments about the maturity level of different resources should not be dominated by economic interests. It should be dominated by it should be controlled by the field. And so Vriti, you want to talk about the DAO and maybe also talk a little bit also about the Ed3 verse, because this is where we see, boy, we really should set up a persistent place for folks in Africa and Europe to connect with each other. And over this next 5 years, there's going to be a lot of things happening that could really be accelerated by some persistent collaboration. And you're a real global leader in this space. Do you want to kind of bring it to that and then we'll end?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Dr. Frumza, I think it's a perfect transition for what you were saying, which is we really need to collaborate on this work. If we don't have enough communication channels and we're not actually doing the work together, then none of this is ever going to be realized. So the DAO, we call it Ed3 DAO. It's a decentralized autonomous organization, meaning that the democratic processes with which the company runs, it's a nonprofit, is actually given to the people that are part of the organization. And we're made up of educators, so innovative educators from around the world that are doing innovative work in the classroom and in ed tech. And so we have talked to the Ed3 group that Greg leads, and we're discussing how can we actually bring the work that he's done with LERs into Ed3 DAO and make it more available to the masses, right? Right now, the people that are on this call, the people that are on this panel are the people that are very, very well informed about what's going on with this work, right? And very sort of, a little bit beyond the sort of like general knowledge base. But I think the way that we can really permeate this work through, different industries and also through education is by bringing it to the common educator, by bringing it to the person who, ultimately will be affected by it. And so our educators are, excited about bringing this work into the DAO. It would be a subcommittee or a sub-DAO. It would be democratized in its own right. So we would set up governance structures for its own sub-DAO that we would sort of, get consensus on from you all. And we would basically lead the efforts as a group and through a democratized way. So that's sort of where we're headed with the DAO. The DAO itself, the goal is to catalyze innovation in education. And the way that we're doing that is we're educating people about emerging tech. We're bringing people together in what Greg just mentioned as the Ed3verse. It's a metaverse environment that uses avatars to basically connect people. And the cool thing about that is, right now we're all in a Zoom meeting. We're all, the only people we can see are the 5 people that are pinpointed. But in this environment that we've developed, you can basically walk around and choose your own adventure, talk to who you want to talk to, and meet with who you want to meet with, go into a room, access a resource. It's very flexible. We just did a conference in it in November, and it was a huge success. So we want to do more of those activities in partnership with everybody here. So that's where we're headed, and we're really excited to sort of, move that this year.
Awesome. Any final words? And Irene, I don't know if you're still, can't see you in my current view, but if any final words for you all?
I'm here, Greg. There's no way I could leave because the knowledge that is being shared is very, very, very good. Maybe just to say thank you to everyone that has taken the time to be part of our panels, to be part of our audience. Why we do this work is we believe that people just need to know. People just need to know. They just need to understand. When there is understanding, there is more adoption. And these are some of the things that we as the LER committee are tasked to do. We'll definitely keep having more of this. So please do expect a couple more invitations to join in different panels that will basically be enabling us to push the technology, to push its understanding, and to enable its appreciation. Probably to close off, I would like to invite Greg to tell us more about, the LER committee, in case you'd like to be involved in that work, in the working team meetings. We're happy to receive you. And I mean, the more the better, we get to build something more concrete. Thank you very much.
Yep. Well, thank you, everyone. And the last link I put in the chat, the last two links, one of them was to the participation form. And so if you want to remain involved, if you'd like to be listed as a contributor to the technical standard, if you'd like to participate as a reviewer of the final standard, and then the community that develops out of it, please go to the Google form, and that's a way that you can kind of raise your hand and say that you want to be involved. Our commitment is that we involve everyone across the world. 6 hours from now, there will be a meeting with folks in Korea and Singapore, and there'll be an Asia Pacific group. And so we really are absolutely committed to this being global. We understand that there is only one Internet of Education, so we all need to get along. So with that, thank you, everyone, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.